Gremlins! Today I'm drawing another old OC I created years ago, a fairy character. This character has gone through a lot of changes since I first created her. She's both one of the oldest and one of the more recent characters. Currently, she is Kaya, a fairy with pale green skin and thick brown hair with insect wings. When I first created this character, she looked completely different and was named Clover. When I was first creating all my characters, there was a period of time where I was creating multiple characters a day, each to fit a certain fantasy species, job, or role in an imaginary game. Due to how many characters I was creating at once, none of these characters had any depth or much backstory. Clover was described as an artsy fairy who lived in a flower pot in some human's garden. That was all there was to her. More recently, a couple of years ago, I went through a lot of the old characters I created in middle school. I redid the art on almost all of them, I added or tweaked backstory and personality details to many of them, and I completely deleted or revamped a few characters. Clover was one of the characters who got completely changed, until she was unrecognizable. Clover, the boring, bland fairy with no personality, became Kaya, a fairy with not one, but two separate fantasy worlds she can belong to, depending on the kind of fairy-related daydream I want to use her in. In both her iterations, Kaya looks the same, has the same job, and has the same relationships. However, one setting is an urban fantasy where fairies forage and steal human resources for their own civilizations, and the other setting has no humans involved at all, and a fairy society in the woods that is self-sufficient. Kaya and her partner Raine, who is non-binary, are both foragers. They live in a community of fairies in the forest, in an apartment in a large knothole in a tree. They have a magically immortal shelf fungus as a front porch, and a pet bumblebee named Clover, as a nod to my original fairy character. As foragers, Kaya and Raine both travel through the woods around the community to gather naturally occurring resources like clay, wood, berries and nuts, and insects. In the urban fantasy settings, they also have more dangerous missions into the nearby human town, where they forage useful litter like bottle caps and broken glass, as well as food from grocery stores like flour, salt, sugar, and vegetables. Occasionally they will also acquire art supplies and fabric for the fairy craftspeople to use. In this drawing, I've drawn Kaya and Raine while out and about foraging. They're foraging blackberries, because that is a job that they would do whether they are in an urban fantasy or in the high fantasy setting. Blackberries don't depend on whether humans are involved in the story. There are a few different elements of fairy technology in this drawing. Most obvious are the baskets and the cart. The baskets are made of woven grass, and would be used until the grass dries up too much to be sturdy. The cart is made with large sections of bark, with wooden discs for wheels. Other elements of the drawing that are less obvious are the belts both fairies wear. Kaya has a belt of 3 strands of braided yarn, and Raine's belt is a knotted belt in the style of those friendship bracelets made from knotted embroidery thread. I'm continuing to use varied line weight in the line art of my drawings, and in this drawing I think I discovered the upper limit. I used an even thicker brush for the thick lines of this drawing, and I think I pushed it too far. While I do like the contrast of thick and thin brushes in areas of more or less detail, I think I used too many thick lines as opposed to thinner ones, and it makes my art style look a bit more clumsy. I think if I'm using lines this thick again, I need to use them more sparingly. The lines dominate this image too much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the line art though. It could just be that it's not a style I'm used to yet. I'll keep experimenting with it in my future art. Throughout this drawing, I've been using a different drawing I made a few years ago as references for the designs of Raine and Kaya. In that drawing, Kaya and Raine are sitting on a mushroom, Kaya's arm around Raine's shoulder. I used this drawing as a reference for the placement of Raine's vitiligo, and as a reference for the colours in both Kaya's and Raine's hair and skin. Raine has light brown skin with patches of pale vitiligo on their shoulder, arms, legs, and face. They also have light blue hair in a spiky pixie cut. Kaya, meanwhile, has pale green skin with freckles on her face, and long, slightly wavy brown hair in a ponytail. I kept the basic elements of Kaya's and Raine's clothing the same in this drawing as they are in the previous drawings I've made of the two. However, I added a lot more detail. I coloured Kaya first, so I'll talk about her design first. Kaya is dressed in a dark green dress with a spiky hem. The hem is decorated with some simple yellow embroidery, and she has a yellow underskirt that peeks out between slits in the overskirt. The dress has a low back and halter-top style sleeves which allow her wings freedom of movement. Kaya's ponytail is tied up with a braid of her own hair. Her arms are stained in blackberry juice from the berries she has been picking. While in previous drawings of Kaya, her wings have been a light silvery white colour, I decided to make both fairies have brown wings, which look more similar to insect wings. Raine, meanwhile, wears blue as opposed to green, and has a more masculine or androgynous style. They also have a shirt with a low back and halter-top design to allow their wings to move. In my sketch, I gave the shirt some slightly detached sleeves, but I removed them from the final design. I also had a bit of troubles with the colours Raine was wearing. I kept messing with the color of their tunic, so that it was neither too dark, nor too close in shade to their blue hair. I also originally colored their knotted belt in shades of blue, then changed it to brown to provide more contrast. On that belt, Raine has a little pouch in which they can keep their tools and/or snacks. Under their tunic, Raine is wearing brown cut-off pants that reach their knees. They also have simple slip-on shoes, although only one foot is visible, perched on the cart for stability, as Raine takes a basket full of blackberries from Kaya. Finally, Raine also has arm guards, just as a stylistic choice, not for any practical function. The fairy community has a few different jobs fairies take up. It is not a money-based society. Each fairy contributes what skills they have to help the community, not for personal gain. Fairies can be foragers, like Kaya and Raine are. They can be crafts fairies, who make things like clothing, pots and pans, tools, furniture, or prepared food like bread. They can be farmers, tending the small patches of agriculture where cherry tomatoes, beans, herbs, and other small edible plants are grown. They can work with animals, like the rodents and birds that fairies use for transport. They can work with other fairies as teachers or healers. In order to carry out their work, Kaya and Raine use a wooden cart pulled by a mouse. The cart is visible in this drawing, the mouse is not, because I didn't want to have to try and draw a mouse as well as two humanoids. Kaya and Raine ride in the cart to whatever location they will forage from, then fill the cart with resources and return to the community, where the resources they find will be taken to a storage log. They also only work a few days a week, since their work is dangerous and energy-intensive. On their days off, they will often spend time in the craft shops, spending time with the craft fairies. Most often, they will either spend time in Raine's sister's shop, the seamstress shop, or in the clay pot shop where Kaya's best friend works. Kaya is artistic. She will often spend her free time sketching or using watercolor from a community watercolor palette. Meanwhile, her partner Raine likes telling stories and cooking. Often they'll do both at once, telling fables and dramatic personal stories while making dinner for Kaya, who listens while sketching pictures of their pet bee, Clover. When planning this drawing, I thought about putting Kaya and Raine in a domestic situation, where I could also feature Clover, but I decided drawing them at work was more interesting and dynamic. I looked up a lot of reference images for this drawing. Drawing such detailed foliage that had to look like a specific species of plant is definitely out of my comfort zone. The background is mostly taken up by the blackberry bush from which this pair of fairies is gathering. While I had a very, very rough sketch of the background from when I first started composing the image, I did some more detailed sketching now, to draw where clusters of berries would grow, as well as leaves and vines. Drawing the berries was actually really fun. I drew a mix of dark, ripe berries, red berries that are getting close to ripe, and pale pinkish berries that are only just starting to grow. I realized later in the drawing that there should be less ripe berries, since Kaya and Raine are currently picking them all, but I can explain that away. Kaya has been picking berries just out of frame, and it doesn't take that many berries to feed a community of 6-inch humanoids for a few days until more are foraged. The fairies don't have to pick every berry, leaving plenty for other wildlife. There's one layer of actual detail in the background, and the rest of the berry bush is just a blurry suggestion behind it. It would take too long and make the background too busy and chaotic to draw the rest of the bush in as much detail. Under the bush, there's a worn dirt path from years of foragers traveling to and from the bush. At the edges of the path, blades of grass are growing. When the background is blocked in, although not yet shaded, I moved back to the foreground to shade the fairies and the cart. I started by shading the skin. Both characters had challenges when shading their skin. Kaya's was difficult to shade because it's green, not the pink or brown skin tones I'm used to shading. I tried to use my normal method of using a cooler, darker tone for shadows and warmer, lighter tones for highlights, but I'm not sure it's as effective on green skin. It just ends up looking very turquoise around her neck and shoulder where the shadows are darkest. Meanwhile, Raine has skin in tones I'm more used to coloring, but their skin is made up of two different skin tones due to their vitiligo. I kept the pale patches on a separate layer and shaded first the brown skin, then the pale skin. I lowered the transparency on the vitiligo patches so I could see where the shadows were on the skin below it, then followed those same lines of shadow to keep the shading smooth between layers. When the skin was shaded, I quickly added highlights to the blackberries in the baskets, which made them look so much more realistic than I expected. I also added texture to the woven grass baskets to indicate the direction each blade of grass is woven in. I then moved on to shading the rest of the foreground, section by section, starting with Kaya. The shading isn't very different from how I normally shade my characters, so I won't spend too much time on it. What is more interesting is shading the background, starting with the blackberries, which I once again had a lot of fun with. It really doesn't take much to make these look very 3D, detailed, and if not realistic, at least fitting to the stylized detail I used in my art. Working on the blackberries was quite relaxing, and I love when my art is just working. It's so motivating. The rest of the blackberry bush was less easy and straightforward, but also less detailed, since the berries are the eye-catcher of the background. I added some simple shading to the vines and leaves, then added more detail to the leaves with veins. I finished the drawing by adding some large sections of shadow and light. I made the background more shadowy since it is the underside of a bush in a forest, and also isn't supposed to outshine the foreground. I also added some light shining from the upper left corner, from which the shadows emulate. Finally, I added some more blades of grass in front of the foreground figures, to make sure they are part of the environment, not placed on top of it. I had a lot of fun with this image. I haven't often drawn images with multiple characters in them, and I find them a fun challenge. I also enjoy making the image tell a story. It isn't just a couple of characters in the background, it's two fairies who are spending their life together, working together to gather food for their community. My favorite part to work on was the background, which isn't usual for me, but the berries were just so fun to draw. I also enjoyed the details of Raine's and Kaya's clothing and wings. If you want a high-quality digital file of this artwork, check out my Etsy, linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed the world building I've made for this world of fairies, and learning about Kaya's life and love. Until next time, bye!